There we go. Hi, Duncan Jepson. Welcome to the National Critics' Choice, and over here at the Grand Hyatt, let's say the Hyatt series. Please tell us more about your latest book that you've published, All the Flowers in Shanghai, which is the first novel, which we came to believe.
Yeah.
And how did that happen?
Well, there's an essay in the back of the book about my mother, and really it was something she said to me a while ago. She was Singaporean, about her choice to stay in England when she could really have gone back to Singapore after university. And as a Eurasian, I think there are many Eurasians in Singapore, constantly struggling with culture and with decisions. And whilst you can look at things in many different ways, unfortunately often you've really got to commit yourself to one direction. And that isn't necessarily something that you're always comfortable with, but you've simply got to choose one thing or another at some point. And I always found these cultural conflicts difficult. And at some point you sort of play with stories about that, and about how to understand that. And the thing that struck me over and over again, being of sort of English and Chinese origin, was this extraordinarily powerful pull of tradition in the Chinese culture, and the sort of very compelling arguments of reason and objectivity that were a bedrock of really Western European and English culture. And so I wanted to find a place to discuss that. And as one becomes better at telling stories, you try to find a way to do that. And having made films, you realize, as an independent filmmaker, there are some very serious practical considerations to telling the kind of story you like to tell in the way. And really, literature provides you with a very, very low-cost means of telling the most grand story that you wish to tell, because really, at the end of the day, it's just black and white. And film, it would be wonderful if everyone had the budget to do that. Well, it might be wonderful, but literature can afford you can afford to do that with literature. And that's how I started to write the book. And the story, as I say, came from this sort of internal discussion I have about cultures and how one finds a balance or makes decisions, and when you can see that there are benefits and disadvantages to both of these areas. I mean, I have English and Chinese, and some people, my nephews, for instance, are quarter Chinese, a quarter English, and half Indian. And there are they'll have even more cultural issues at play. So that was where the book came from. And the idea was, well, who would this be about? And I wanted it to be about a woman, because I felt that in Asia, women have an even more difficult situation. There was massive gender bias, as there still is in many places. There were issues of where is the future as a woman. And in the 1930s in China, there was this change. There was this movement in Shanghai to embrace the West, which is not what a lot of China was doing, a lot of Asia, and that I thought was interesting. And at the same time, there was pressing international issues on a political level of Japanese, and there was obviously World War II commencing, and then later on there was internal struggles. So it was a time of change for Chinese people in general to reevaluate, and it seemed a good place to cite an individual who's struggling with her own issues of growth and change. And that was a good place to tell a story, which I would never be able to do with film, personally. I mean, I wouldn't be able to raise the budget, and so literature seemed the place to go, or just writing, and therefore sort of started to pen this out, and that's where it started.
And so, what actually inspired you to first begin to write about Shanghai and the Shanghainese women and the culture overall? I mean, what was the story behind it?
It was it's primarily because Shanghai offered that location of the first embrace of cosmopolitan 20th century life. And I'd worked in Shanghai in the early 90s. I'd been at Beijing Language Institute in the late 80s as part of my own ongoing sort of self-awareness. Being half Chinese, I wanted to go to learn Chinese, to learn Mandarin, and I went to China instead of anywhere else in '87 and learned a reasonable amount to be vaguely competent, and then came here actually in '88 to further those studies. But being in China, I was completely smitten by mainland China, and then later on travelled around more, and then got a job in the UK that sent me to Shanghai, and then set up my own small company. And I spent a lot of time in Shanghai, and particularly in the Peace Hotel. And it wasn't a popular hotel. Most people would stay elsewhere, because it was of yesteryear. It needed updating, but it was also a romantic and nostalgic place, and I enjoyed that as my early 20s. And roaming around Shanghai, there weren't many foreigners there then either, and so I got to see things that were largely untouched by the idea of tourism, that were, you know, unpolished for visitors, and that gave me insight into how life might have been. And then speaking to people and discussing it and reading, and also I made a film about hip hop in China, a feature documentary in 2006, and in the opening credits I wanted to tell the story for people who didn't understand where China had been. So in the opening credits I used still photographs and old black and white footage, and then more modern footage to sort of touch on various what I consider to be key points in China's cultural change. And one of those was some British Film Institute footage of people dancing in Shanghai. And there's quite a lot of still photographs available from that period. And, you know, combination of stills, footage that I'd seen, people's stories, I managed to piece together what it was like there. And it seemed a glorious place, and a place to set the book that gave it more colour. And I think that comes from making film. As you think about locations, you think about design. And when I'm thinking about the book, I'm thinking, well, yeah, I could sit it in Xiamen. I mean, Xiamen was a place I visited with my grandfather, and I knew Xiamen a bit. I could have gone back. I went to Gulangyu where he was stationed. There's a nice sort of nostalgia there as well, but it didn't have the same vibrancy that Shanghai had and the same colours. And I think I wanted to discuss this issue of change, of traditional conflict, with the conflict of tradition versus change, and Shanghai was the best place to do that because that's where it was occurring in China. So that's what inspired me to use Shanghai, and it fit well with the story. So that's how I approached that.
About the culture of Shanghai, you know, and traditions, you explained very, very much in detail. How did that come about? Was there intense, scouting of old traditions while you're back in Shanghai?
There's an element of that. I mean, it's there's a few things. One is just basic research on Chinese culture. The one thing that I'd known, being inquisitive and asking my relatives about, and listening to friends who are Chinese and their parents about traditions, was that I'd noted that, for instance, at funerals, there are so many different ways that Chinese culture can perform funeral. And each time you ask, they'll say, oh, but this is the way that it's done in Hokkien circle or Cantonese, and actually you find there are all these tiny differences. And the one thing I realised is that if you ask them, well, is it right? I say, oh, of course it's right. And you say, but what about the family over there, the Wong family? They do it differently. Oh, yeah, but they don't really know. So what I learnt is that, and that was the point in the book, is that this family, this huge family, grows up and has this huge house, and it's taken things that are very familiar to most people, both Chinese and otherwise, as, oh yes, I know they do that, and they have a photograph, and they stand at the coffin and they do this, but then there's these tiny details that nobody can really agree on, which is a beautiful thing about tradition, is that everyone's got it's not written anywhere specifically. Everyone's got a slightly different take on it that's passed from one generation to the next, and providing people don't become too consumed by the details, which is what does happen at times. What I used was the idea that these things are to be played with, and they just keep evolving. And often I'll hear people in Hong Kong say, oh, look, he's wearing a marquois, and he's not wearing it properly. And then a little research will tell me that you need to go back 40 years to realise that the marquois was worn slightly differently 40 years ago, and it was worn slightly differently before then, and obviously it goes back and back. And the one thing I wanted to put in the book is that there's nothing really solid about this. It's constantly moving and changing. And so I took the research from Shanghainese people, research from my own experiences of weddings and funerals, and tried to distill it down to something that I think firstly could be read and understood by people who weren't familiar with Chinese culture. Because it's a lot to absorb. I mean, I think anybody who doesn't know Chinese culture is always completely mesmerized by the colors, by the ritualism, by the performance, by the complexity of it. And then Chinese people also like that. They hide a lot behind all of this. You can never understand. It's Chinese, and as a Eurasian, I've always been slightly bemused by it, because you know that they're different. Ultimately, there's always subtleties, which is beautiful in itself. But so I used that as part of the story, and the idea that traditional attitudes do change, and ritualism does change, and that really people tend to make it up on their own. I mean, it's quite revisionist as well, which is what the family do in the story, is that they've made up some things themselves. And it says, they became so wealthy at some point that, they simply made things up. Nobody could really tell where one thing ended and the other thing began. But I did try and stick closely to what I'd understood from other people and the research. And the other part of it is that it was a period of decay. People on the ground, people were getting tired of it. People wanted to change, and there were millions of people who were simply poor and unhappy. And they forced change as well. So Feng, the central character, she's there, not particularly content with her situation, but at the same time it's too comfortable to want to leave it. I mean, to me, it's a classic human conundrum. We know there's something wrong, but we are often far too comfortable to want to do much about it. And so she's forced to, because in that point in time there were too many external forces for her to resist. But I tried to stick as closely as possible to things that I'd found, but deliberately did mix a couple of them together. And also with a bit of poetic license, and I used that somewhat generously to myself. But I tried to make it a bit more colourful so that people wouldn't think, oh wait, this is a research document in the end of the day. And also I'd found that a lot of young Chinese people didn't seem to know the slightest thing about some of the basic tenets of the rituals that their ancestors had performed anyway. So I thought, well, let's just start with something that's digestible, that's a bit more general, but I can indulge in some of the specifics, such as people standing on, say, the left of the coffin or the right of the coffin, or in a Cantonese funeral there might be some people on the left, and then there might be the individual performing the ceremony on the right, calling out the bowing, and so there are things that I could do, but I decided to use one thing rather than another, because I knew that if I researched it so slavishly, because there are differences, somebody somewhere would ultimately say, yes, but I'm Shanghainese and I was born in 1936 and I know the fact that we didn't do this, and somebody has said that, and I think that's difficult. And it detracts from the idea that this is ultimately a story, and it's fiction. It's not supposed to be a historical document. And as a documentary maker, I think if you want fact, you've got to go back to the books, and you've got to go to documentary evidence and proper research. You shouldn't be necessarily looking at fiction as a total source of information. I think that would be a mistake. But it should obviously be heavily grounded in fact, with I think the entertainment value.
Speaking about entertainment value, in the book that you've written, so far, and while you were researching back in Shanghai, has many of the locals actually mistaken you as Chinese from other provinces, and at the same time, what is Chinese culture?
It's a massive question. It has. propelled me in all sorts of directions. I remember first coming back from Beijing in '87 when I was just 18, and I was with my mother, and we were arguing about Chinese culture as tended to do, and I said, I don't really get it. I don't see what's so Chinese about Singaporeans. Chinese culture is what's happening in mainland China, right? That's where Chinese people are, and it was very simplistic, no doubt. But my view is what I saw in China was so fundamentally different from what I'd experienced here that we had to decide one of these two things had to be Chinese culture, right? In my sort of rather simplistic delineation. And we came to, she just didn't like that at all. Her view was, but the people in mainland China, what do they know? It's Chinese culture is Singapore. And then I pointed out to her, which brought the conversation to a swift end, was that, well, wait a second, she was in England for pretty much since she was 16, 17. So I said, well, what do you know about Chinese culture? You haven't even been to either place in many, many years of any duration. So what is the culture that we practice or we have? And I said, well, the conversation came to a very swift end because her view was, well, one of these things has to be Chinese culture, right? But I'm not going to tell you which one, but it's got to be mine. And so when I went to China, I spent a lot of time. I decided that when I was younger, that's what it would be. And I spoke enough Mandarin to be to have conversations and to find out more. And I generally travel by train, and I tried to travel on my own and with just mixing with local people wherever they are. And when you travel from Beijing, Shanghai, to Gansu, to Zhengzhou, to all these different places and regions and cities, you realize that there's so many different types of people. And yeah, sometimes I got mistaken for different types. In Shanghai, the people I worked with, they used to call me Xiao Deng. And because I was quite young, I was only sort of 24. And most of the people working were in their sort of late 30s, early 40s or 50s. So I was a bit of a strange sort of, it was an anomaly in a way. But they recognized the fact that I was seeking to understand Chinese culture. I was half Chinese in some way, shape, or form, and I wanted to know more. So I did get sometimes I was mistaken, but more often than not, it was a case of the fact that I was incredibly eager to learn, and I wasn't. I didn't come with a sort of overbearing attitude of a person from say the West, and I could do this and that. I was quite young, and my issue was I just wanted to know more. So I was very generally well received or embraced, and often taken to places and shown things and just talked to in a manner that was just and quite local in a way. So I learned a lot and enjoyed it very much.
For the character of Miss Feng, you describe her in such a detail, even in her emotions. May I ask, do you have any form of relationship with a Shanghainese woman during that time? Because you got to have someone who's able to write such a detailed description of her emotions. Should have been may have an encounter before.
No, not at all. Not at all. I mean, it's just all from imagination, and from, one tries to understand, does one best to understand people. When you work every day and you're working in teams, and I like to work in teams, you must understand the people you work with, you must understand, and it's ongoing, process. You try your best, and that's really where, with a character, you form this strange relationship with this character who obviously to begin with doesn't exist at all, and as you proceed they grow in detail, and they grow in sort of substance, and in your mind for me, in my mind, that brought them to life. And so you think, well, where are they going to go from here? What are they going to go do? And sometimes it may make sense to me, and other times people will look at the same thing and say, well, it doesn't make any sense to me at all. Why would that person do that? But no, I've had no it's not based on anybody at all. It's just purely made up. That's it, really.
Oh, and then the next question is that, how how do you plan to go from here? I mean, while you were writing this book itself, and how long did it take you to write this entire project? Were there team members, as you mentioned, and how many team members were there involved?
For the book, I started writing when my mother died of breast cancer in 2007, and when someone gets to that point at which really they're not conscious, they're deteriorating. So there's a massive period of waiting, and whilst we were sort of waiting, there were various things to do. But one of the things I did was I just started to write the story because I just had time. And that's it. Just this time was there, and there was nothing to do. So I just started to write. So I put down about 20, maybe 18,000 to 20,000 words, and I had previously, with my friend and my business partner, a gentleman called Ilyas Khan, we'd set up a literary agency, and we're very fortunate to have met a lady in Hong Kong, who's now my agent, but she came to join us on this strange journey because neither of us knew anything about literary agencies, to be honest. But we enjoyed literature and thought that this was something that was missing in Hong Kong. So Marisha joined us, and we set this thing up and did some good work, I think. It wasn't successful financially, and ultimately what we did achieve was the sort of seed of her current her business, which she's developed quite significantly. But during that period, I was not a confident writer. I'm not sure that I am now. But after a while, I sent it to her and said, "Well, what do you think? Have a read." And she said, "Why don't you just continue?" But my mother then passed away, and events took over and back to work and so forth, and so I didn't really do anything for about 6-7 months, and then she suggested, "Well, why don't we just send it out and and maybe add a few, finish?" And I said, "No, I don't want to finish." So I added a few thousand words more, and then we sent it out under a pseudonym to about 4 publishers, and they wrote back and said, to my surprise, "Hey, this isn't bad, but where's it going? Where's the rest?" And of course, the rest wasn't available. But I felt a bit more confident about the fact that it was of some sort of standard, some sort of quality. But I didn't feel like continuing it, to be honest. And I got sidetracked onto the story that I'm actually doing now, that I've about a third of the way through, which was about a serial killer. So I proceeded to do that and got about 25,000 words into that. And then that actually had more substance to it because it's not written in the first person. I mean, the problem with the first person, there's a reason why it's in the first person, but the problem is it's quite difficult unless you read the whole thing, because you're thinking, well, what is this exactly, and where does it go? So I then suggested to Marisha, well, can we send out this serial killer thing instead? So again, we sent it out under a pseudonym, and to one publisher, and they wrote back and said, "This is pretty interesting. Where's the rest of it?" So I began to think, well, I seem to be able to put pen to paper to create something, but what happens next? And I happened to meet that publisher, came to Hong Kong, and I met her, and she said, you seem to be able to write. Why don't you get on and finish one of these things? So I thought, well, that's a pretty good point. So I then wrote more, and I tell you, this is how tentative I am. I then wrote more of of all the flowers. I got to about 35,000 words, and then I said, I've written another 15 or whatever. Can we send it out to a few more people? So we sent it out to 6 publishers, and they rejected it. But they said, 2 of them said, well, where's the rest? So I then had to bite the bullet, but I just did nothing. I did for nothing. The market started to crash. I was regional general counsel of ING Investment Management. There's 11 businesses. We had one here in Singapore. There's Australia, India, Japan, Taiwan, Korea, so forth. And markets were tanking. There was work to be done, and the last thing on my mind really was writing a book. Although I did finish a film on a documentary about Nepal, but the book got shelved. And then at the end of 2009, when things started to calm down, but become more stable financially, I met a publisher, an editor, again in Hong Kong, who said, just get on with it. So then on the January the 2nd, 2010, I believe, I basically decided, you know what, just do 1,200 words a day until whenever, and finish this thing. So every day I did 1,200 words. Sometimes I did more, in which case I subtracted them from the next day's efforts, quota. Sometimes I did less, in which case they got added to the next day's quota. And I just did 1,200 a day until I got to April the 4th. And then I finished. And then I reread it a few times and thought, well, okay, that's what I've got. And then we sent it to a line editor, a lady in England called Lynn Curtis. And she was extremely helpful, and she came out with lots of suggestions, and some of which I took, some of which I didn't. And then we sent it out under my own name, and it was about 20. Marisha sent it out. It was about 24, 25 publishers, and I think the 21st, HarperCollins said we'd like to take it, and. To me it seemed pretty straightforward. Someone's offering to take your book, you just say yes. So I just said, that HarperCollins as well, you can't, to me, you couldn't argue with that. So I just said yes. That was wonderful. And then the process, and the editing after that was actually very minimal. There is more to the story. There was about 40,000 words more, which brings it into the 21st century, the latter 20th century. And we took those out because we felt that it was, well, I felt, but Wendy, who was the editor, felt that it was actually a bit distracting. So reduced it down to the story that really is in the first part of the 20th century. But there was there was a sort of the push of the daughter into living in America, and her daughter, and how the sort of cycle goes around. So that was taken out, and that still is in draft somewhere. So that's both the process of me executing it. And I approached it in a fairly corporate fashion, to be honest. I just said 1,200 words a day, just do it. Get on and execute, sort of thing. It was, okay, it's hardly romantic, but that's the way it seems to be. And that's how, to me, you make films. If you want to make a film, then you start with a blank sheet of paper, and then you go forward. You can have a lot of meetings over coffee and talk about it till you're blue in the face, but it isn't going to make you a film. And the same thing with this. So I think it's, that discipline is enormously helpful, of just getting down to do the work and getting it out. And that's both how I came to get it published and.
So it must have taken you about 2 to 3 years.
In total, it took me 3 years.
3 years.
But to be honest, time-wise, the first 15,000 words were probably done in a week and a half, and then I didn't do anything really for a year and a bit, maybe, and then a bit more, and then nothing until 2010, and that was it. And then it was a period of 3 months in 2010.
What's next right now? Now you have your book now that's been published and widely circulated around Asia and the United States. Are you into your next book right now?
Yes, well, I started another story about bullying, which was set in the UK, and I've sort of got that in my mind, but I had the 25, which is now 40,000 words of the serial killer story. So the sort of prevailing view was, between myself, Marisha, and I think just common sense, was get on with and finish the serial killer story. So that's really what I've been doing, and I've added another, I think, 10,000 words in the last couple of weeks, but I really need to sit down and get to that in the same sort of manner as last time. So that's the next, well, that's not the next, that's the current project. And I came here actually with my father and my brother and my nephews to visit Singapore. My father hadn't been back for a while. my nephews had never been, so it came primarily then. But I still bought my computer, and I've still been sort of writing a bit and doing a bit of research. So that's the current project. And then I have another film that I've been doing for about 2 years that I'm trying to finish. So in the next few months, I hope to get those things done.
Would you ever consider making this film into a movie? I mean, the novel. I'm sorry. You know.
No, I don't think I would. I'm still quite a inexperienced director, and it needs somebody who really knows how to work at that level, and that's not me. And I'd like to say at least not yet, but one never knows whether one will ever get there. But it's not me anyway, and particularly because of the level of detail in it. I know I see it obviously even in greater detail than that. So I can never do it justice, to be honest, I don't think. And I'm also intrigued by somebody else doing justice to it. Somebody taking and saying, okay, well, we're going to give it a go and change it and say, well, actually some of these things don't necessarily agree with. And I think that's also what's interesting, is to someone to take the character and say, well, I don't think she would do that. I might have an argument about it, but actually I'm more interested in seeing how somebody else sees the world. I think that's much more interesting.
What are you going to do with the sequel of the unpublished work that is based on the Old Flowers in Shanghai, the daughter that you mentioned?
Yeah, I
mean, are you going to turn it into an e-book or some
I
sort?
actually have no idea. I was just sitting on my computer. I mean, it's you see, the point of the story was also, the original title was called Before You, and the idea was it was a mother recounting to her daughter all the reasons why life is as it is. And often children look at their life and say, well, I don't understand, why is it like this and why did we do that? And particularly in Asia, because progress has been so quick. You know, I remember, I don't know whether I should tell the story, but anyway, I'm going to tell it. But I remember talking to Mr. Harold Shaw, who's across the road, and we were talking about Perth, the second film we did, which he was very supportive of. I mean, really supportive, and distributed in Singapore. And we were talking about the early days in Singapore in the 60s, and when the government was newly formed, and I'm maybe getting some of the facts wrong here, but this was the sort of anecdotal end of it, was that there weren't very many cars for dignitaries to travel, and one of the cars that was available was his car, which I think he said was a Jag, but I probably got this wrong. But he, I think some dignitary arrived at the airport, and then there was a ring around from the government, from the Foreign Office, which was obviously fairly fledgling at the time, saying, you know, we need a car to go pick up X dignitary. Have you got yours available? And he said, the driver was, no, the driver's gone out for lunch, so you're going to have to use something else. And there was that sense of, you know, that was only, I believe, in the mid-60s, so that was actually only 35, 40 years ago. And Singapore has grown so enormously. So to understand all of the consequences, all of the changes, all of the machinations that will have taken place, a child, to have that unravelled, would require somebody to sit down and really tell in enormous detail exactly how people's lives changed and were thrown around at the sort of vicissitudes of what occurs. And the idea was that somebody should sit down and say, you know, for a Chinese person, the journey to the States, to what I think most people say normalcy, and you know, a nice upper middle class education, an Ivy League university, maybe a good job, to get to that point, from leaving Shanghai, Xiamen, Beijing, Tianjin, all these places, that's a lot of traveling, a lot of journeying, when some dreadful things happened. And